So we continue our look of the foreign policy of the Soviet Union under the leadership of Brezhnev. And in this video, we're really going to be looking at the Soviet Union's bid for leadership of the communist world. So you've seen these learning objectives before. Basically, we're looking at various parts of the world and understanding Russia's overall aims here. Now, what you need to do is to bring the knowledge gained from the previous lectures forward to utilize here. So here we're going to be looking at China, Africa, the Americas, as well as the Middle East. You also should, after you finish watching the videos, take a little bit of notes and analyze the success of the policies. I'm not going to include red questions and ask you to do it, but you should be ready and willing to do it yourself. And then kind of review the previous information and consider what was happening domestically that may influence their involvement in these areas, and how is this going to reflect on the domestic situation in the Soviet Union. So one of the most important things that is influencing foreign policy under Brezhnev is, in a way, this fight for control and to be the leader of the communist world. And despite one of the major foreign policy goals was maintaining détente with the West, this fight for leadership of the communist world, sometimes the decisions that were made really threw that détente into jeopardy. And as you know, one of the really big sort of reasons behind this competition is the breakdown of the relationship with China that began with Khrushchev. Once that happened, then essentially you now have two nodes of communism in the world. And it kind of gives countries a choice of which model to follow. And the Soviet Union is very interested in maintaining its sort of global importance and influence. And that is going to mean that they are essentially competing with China for that influence. And that leadership is happening in East Asia as well as the developing world. In this time, in the 1960s, 50s and 60s, you have, this is the era of decolonization. And a lot of countries in Asia and in Africa are establishing themselves as new states. And there is a choice as to what model they're going to follow for statehood. And of course, there's competition with the US for those states. But now, with the breakdown of the relationship in China, you also have competition with, with China. So yeah, it's bad news all around, man. And Vietnam is a fine example of the sort of rock and hard place that the Soviet Union found herself in. So Vietnam, East Asia, again, they're very close to China, shares a border with. And at the same time, Soviet involvement in Vietnam is going to stir the pot and create tension with the US. So first, a little background about Vietnam. After World War II, France attempts to reassert her colonial rule of Indochina. Now, the Vietnamese were not so happy to welcome France back. And so France finds itself in a war, the First Indochina War with the Viet Minh, led by Ho Chi Minh. And the war, basically Vietnam is seeking its independence. And so it drags on until 1954, where the Geneva Agreement is signed and Vietnam is partitioned into North and South Vietnam. So the northern part of Vietnam becomes the Communist Republic of North Vietnam and the non-communist Republic of South Vietnam. Now, one of the things that's also happening here is that the U.S. believes in this domino theory. This is one of the reasons why they were so involved with Japan as well as South Korea. And the idea is that if one domino falls, then the others will fall afterward. So the U.S. is seeing South Vietnam as acting as a barrier against the expansion of communists into Southeast Asia. So what they start doing is funding South Vietnam quite a bit. Now, of course, you have the sense of nationalism within Vietnam, and people want to reunite Vietnam into a single country. And you have the Viet Cong, or in Vietnamese, Viet Cong, a guerrilla group that was active in South Vietnam, trying to overthrow the South Vietnamese government so that they could unite it. And so now you have, it involves into a civil war between the North and South Vietnam. And this escalates into a large conflict. Now, generally, depending on who you speak to, in Vietnam, this is called the American War. In the US, it's called the Vietnam War, but most historians refer to it as the Second Indochina War. And basically, in this, you see a change in the Soviet policy. Khrushchev originally was like, my name's Bennett, I ain't in it. He wasn't getting terribly involved. However, once the US escalates her involvement and starts bombing North Vietnam, Brezhnev changes the policy and starts supporting the Viet Cong with weapons and military advisors. Now, the thing is that Brezhnev wasn't so much worried about defeating the US. But what they didn't want was China to become involved in North Vietnam and eclipse Soviet influence in the area. Oops. And of course, the Soviet presence is also in the Middle East. This began under Khrushchev's regime, with the creation of the State of Israel and American support for Israel. You have the Arab countries immediately on the other side. And the Soviet Union took advantage of that negative feeling to gain allies in the Middle East. And so in the Arab-Israeli War of 1967, also called the Six-Day War because you have some limited support for the Arabs. And basically, everybody was supposed to be staying out of it, but there is some military aid. There's some rumors, he said, she said, whatever. But basically, they're just dipping their toe in the water here. In the Arab-Israeli War of 1973, also known as the Yom Kippur War, or if you're on the other side, also known as the Ramadan War, they are even more involved. The Soviet Union sends a huge amount of weaponry to the Egyptians and the Syrians. They also provide military advisors. And now that the Soviet Union has increased their involvement for the Arabs, the U.S. gets involved as well. And basically, the U.S. deploys ships there and makes it look like she's ready to jump into the war, which the Soviets are like, oh no, this is not worth it. It is not worth it to go into World War III over this conflict, which is really of minimal importance to the Soviet Union and significance. So this essentially is just another example of the Soviet Union growing influence outside of areas that are immediately of concern. Now, this, of course, maybe not of course, but after the end of the Arab-Israeli War, the U.S. brokers a peace to help end the war between Egypt, Syria, and Israel. And you also have had a change of leadership within Egypt, and they start reorienting themselves closer to the West. And eventually, under a rising tide of nationalism and etc., the Russian advisors are kicked out, and Egypt turns her attention towards the West. So the conflict in 1965 between India and Pakistan offers the Soviet Union another opportunity to get involved on the Indian subcontinent. So, as you know, when India was in conflict with China, the Soviet Union took the side of India. And initially, they supported India. However, once the U.S. pulls their support from Pakistan, because basically they said that this war is totally Pakistan's fault, then the Soviet Union takes a different tactic. Also, China gets involved supporting Pakistan. So the Soviet Union actually works to prevent escalation. And Kosygin gets involved and brokers a peace treaty between India and Pakistan in 1966. And there on the right, you have an image of the three people together as they signed this Tashkent Declaration. Now, basically, what Kosygin did, and remember at this point, he is the premier of the country. Essentially, what he did is he invited the various actors to Tashkent, which is in the Uzbek Soviet Socialist Republic at the time, and brokers this. Now, this is one of the things that you're seeing early in the 1960s when Kosygin had political power and influence. He was the dominant figure in the foreign policy of the Soviet Union. Now, in Africa and the Americas, I'm not going to go into this in too much depth, but this is also to kind of show you the extent of the Soviet involvement and the extent of this desire to be powerful on the international stage. In Angola, they supported the People's Movement for the Liberation of Angola against the American-backed National Union for the Total Independence of Angola. I know. In Mozambique, they supported the Fremilo against the Portuguese when they were seeking independence as a colony. In Somalia and Eritrea, they supported the guerrillas, and the negative impact was the guerrillas are going to disrupt things so much that it's going to result in famine. In Nicaragua, and this is also one of those things that becomes testy, because again, historically, the Americas was in the sphere of influence and acknowledged as much of the U.S. And so what they're doing there is they support the guerrillas, the Sandinista Liberation Front, against the American-backed Somoza government. Now, the government wasn't good, but the U.S. was working to the same thing that the Soviet Union was doing to support whichever government agreed to stamp out communism. Then they supported the government, whether it was a liberal democratic government or not. So in the next slide, take a look again at the map of where the U.S. and the Soviet Union were establishing their influence globally. All right, and so here again, we have a handy dandy map of the world and the allied countries of either with the U.S. or with the Soviet Union. And you've seen this map before. So once again, here we have the NATO countries in dark blue, and then in lighter blue you have the other countries that were not members of NATO but were allied with the Western countries and fighting communism. In red, we have the Warsaw Pact countries, so the USSR and Eastern Europe. And then we have in pink socialist countries that were allied with the Soviet Union. Now, the other thing that we have here is, if you can see here, in areas that are acknowledged to be places of U.S. influence, you have the Soviet Union supporting communist guerrillas. And then in other areas, socialist countries that were allied with the Soviet Union, you have the U.S. supporting anti-communist guerrillas. Tit for tat, everybody was doing it. Now let's take a quick look at China from the foreign policy stance of the Soviet Union. Now, one of the things that you should be doing as we talk about this, you should be thinking about it in the context of what we spoke about in terms of Mao and China. Now, as you know, problems between China and the Soviet Union develop and come to bear during Khrushchev's regime. And Khrushchev ultimately pulls all the Soviet advisors out of China, and they kind of go on opposite sides of the ring. Now, these problems are based on the quality or the nature of the relationship between the two states, as in, are they going to be equal communist partners, or whether one would be dominant over the other? And the problems were also ideological. Okay. And in 1965, the Soviets attempt to heal this rift with China, but it's a failure. Now, the Soviets go to China, and China is expecting them to be discussing how can China and the Soviet Union work together to help out North Vietnam in this Vietnam War. And this is what Mao is expecting. And the Soviets instead are all like, yeah, so, dude, we totally should be like unified because communism should be unified. And China is all kinds of upset at this. And then, of course, you have Chinese students attacking the American embassy in the Soviet Union. So both sides actually kind of have egg on their face. And of course, as you know, in 1966, Mao's Cultural Revolution begins. And as Mao is trying to place everybody back onto the path of correct revolution and correct communism, he is attacking the Soviet Union in the speeches. He is pointing out the Soviet Union as being a fail that they don't want to be. And so the Soviet Union is like, oh no, you do not get to talk all kinds of bad about me. I am going to bring you down. You know, but in Russian. So the Soviet Union is blasting stuff on the radio, encouraging the Chinese people to turn against their leaders. Now, in 1969, this is where we get into a biggie. There's conflict over ownership of Damansky Island, and there's fighting between the troops, and there's border skirmishes between China and the Soviet Union. And this almost came to heavy armed conflict. Kosygin stops by and has a meeting with Zhou Enlai, and this improves and normalizes relations later in 1969. So it takes about 7 months before Kosygin comes in and has this meeting. And they basically agree to bring their ambassadors back and try to sort things out, but it took until 2003 for them to decide on the ownership of these islands and these borders. Okay, guys, this one is pretty bad, but here is your surprise. I changed my iPhone's name to Titanic. It's sinking now. Sorry, it's so bad.